Rome, 1480. Beneath the golden domes of cathedrals and the echo of sacred chants, a child opens her eyes for the first time, not into grace, but into a game already set in motion. Her name is Lucrezia Borgia. She was born not for love or legacy, but for leverage. In a time when holiness was for sale and power passed through blood, gold, and betrayal, this girl would become both witness and victim to one of history's darkest dynasties. This is not the story of a temptress. This is not the tale of a poisoner. This is the true, haunting life of a woman who was born into corruption. Branded by scandal and buried beneath lies she didn't create, Lucrezia Borgia was born in the spring of 1480 in the bustling, dangerous heart of Renaissance Rome, a city wrapped in contradictions. Artists chiseled beauty from marble, while assassins prowled beneath the cloisters of power. Religion promised salvation, but behind cathedral walls, sins flourished. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was not yet pope, but he was already powerful. A Spanish cardinal with sharp instincts and sharper ambitions. Her mother, Vanessa de Catone, was not a wife. She was a long-term mistress. Their union was neither blessed nor hidden, and from it came multiple children. Among them, Cesar Juan, Jaffer, and Lucrezia. She was born illegitimate, a social curse in most of Europe, not for a Borgia. Rodrigo, ever calculating, saw in Lucrezia a valuable asset. Unlike other illegitimate daughters who were locked away in convents or quietly erased from family lines, Lucrezia was groomed. She was taught not only languages and dance, but how to smile when being sold. Because make no mistake, Lucrezia was never raised to be free. She was raised to be useful. Rodrigo Borgia's ambitions were not subtle. He wanted the highest seat. In Christendom, the papal throne, and in 1492, bought it. Yes, bought it. The conclave that elected popes was meant to be sacred, guided by the Holy Spirit. But Rodrigo turned it into an auction. Gold flowed into Rome like a river, and the College of Cardinals, hungry and corrupt, gave him the tiara. He became Pope Alexander VI, the shepherd of Christ's flock. But also quite possibly the most debauched pope in history, and with his new crown came new uses for Lucrezia. She was only 12 in Renaissance Italy. Marriage was a political weapon. Love was never required. Only loyalty, lineage, and leverage. At the age of 13, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, nobleman from Milan. The ceremony took place inside the Vatican itself, a wedding in the shadow of corruption. She wore gold and white. He brought soldiers and promises, but neither mattered. The alliance was useful. For a time, when the Sforzes fell out of favor, Pope Alexander needed an escape. He declared the marriage null, claimed it was never consummated. Giovanni, enraged, accused the Pope of wanting Lucrezia back for himself. The rumors exploded. Incest, lust, papal perversion, they were never proven. But they didn't need to be in Rome. Reputation was as fragile as truth. Lucrezia's second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince from Naples. By now, she was 17, and there were whispers she had finally found affection. They had a son, Rodrigo, and for a short time, Lucrezia smiled without fear. But happiness was not a Borgia privilege. Cesar Borgia, her brilliant and terrifying brother, saw Alfonso as a threat. To what? Perhaps to his influence. Perhaps something more. One night, Alfonso was stabbed outside St. Peter's. He survived. Lucrezia tended to him daily, guarding his food, praying in private. But her efforts were in vain. Weeks later, while recovering in bed, Caesar's men returned. The prince was strangled. The official cause of death, fever, the truth. Fratricide. Lucrezia watched the man she loved, the father of her child, be murdered by her own brother, likely with her father's blessing. And what did she do? She cried. Then she remained silent, because in the Borgia world, grief was weakness, silence was survival. The Vatican, under Alexander VI, became a theater of sin. It wasn't rumor. It was reality, documented by those who dared to write what they saw. Papal apartments were used for orgies. Cardinals bribed their way into red hats. And feasts were held that made the pagan past look tame. One infamous night, the banquet of chestnuts, 50 courtesans were invited to the papal halls. They danced naked while Alexander and Caesar watched. Coins were thrown, prizes were awarded for performance. Lucretia by then was likely present, perhaps not as a guest, perhaps not even as a participant, but as a witness to a world that had turned her body into a bargaining chip. She had seen too much. She had no way out. By 1501, the name Borgia had become both a blessing and a curse. Lucretia, now 21, had been a pawn in 2 failed political marriages. Accused of incest, suspected of poisoning, and drenched in scandal. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, needed a clean slate for her, one final alliance that would secure the family legacy. Enter Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The Este family was powerful, refined, and respected across Italy. But they were no fools. They knew what the Borgias were. They had read the rumors, heard the whispers, so when Pope Alexander proposed the match, cated not out of morality, but out of caution, they demanded an outrageous dowry. Money, jewels, political favors. The price of marrying Lucretia was steep, and Rodrigo Borgia paid it all, because Lucretia wasn't just a daughter. She was the bridge between his power and his future. Ferrara was not Rome here. The streets smelled of fresh bread and ink, not blood and incense. Here, men debated poetry more than poison, and here, for the first time, Lucretia began to breathe. The court expected a viper, a femme fatale, but what arrived was a soft-spoken woman, fluent in Latin, poetry, and diplomacy. She smiled when greeted. She painted. She prayed. And yet, she had not forgotten. Behind every warm greeting was the instinct to scan the room. Behind every hand extended in welcome, she saw the ghosts of her past lovers. She knew Ferrara was her last chance, and she played her role well. She became a patron of the arts, protector of scholars, a host to poets, painters, and musicians, and slowly the city fell in love with her. But inside the palace walls was not a fairy tale. Alfonso d'Este was not cruel, but neither was he kind. He was a soldier, a tactician, a man raised among steel and strategy. He had married Lucretia for Ferrara, not for affection. He rarely spoke to her, rarely looked at her. And when he did, it was not with passion, but suspicion. Lucretia, ever the survivor, bore it all. She raised her children, attended church, managed court affairs, but she was alone, terribly alone, and that loneliness gave birth to new whispers. Among the men of Ferrara was one closer than a husband, a man who wrote her letters, organized her events, translated her correspondence. His name was Francesco Gonzaga, or in other tellings, Pietro Bembo, a poet and future cardinal. Records blur, but the letters remain. The writings between Lucretia and this man, whether lover or dear friend, are still preserved. And they reveal a different side of her, a woman longing for connection. A woman who wrote, "I am yours, wholly yours, whether I live or die." The Vatican would have burned such letters. Ferrara preserved them. Was it love? Was it escape? We will never truly know. But we know she felt, and we know she was not the monster history claimed. Back in Rome, the Borgia Empire began to crack. In 1503, Pope Alexander VI, her father, collapsed after a banquet. The cause? Fever, possibly malaria, possibly poison. Even in death, he was surrounded by rumor. Caesar Borgia, once the terror of Italy, was now vulnerable. Without the papal throne to shield him, his enemies circled like vultures. Lucretia did not return to Rome. She received the news of her father's death in silence. No public mourning, no political moves, just one more tie to the past. Quietly severed, the world she was born into was vanishing. And she had begun to build a new one. For years, Caesar Borgia had been the sword of the family. Ruthless, brilliant, and ambitious, He had carved a kingdom across central Italy. Even Machiavelli admired him. The prince was partly inspired by Caesar's political cunning. But power, without protection, is a fragile throne. After Alexander's death, Caesar's allies vanished. His troops deserted him. He was captured, escaped, and fled to Spain in 1507. He died in battle, stabbed multiple times. His body stripped and left unburied. When word reached Ferrara, Lucrezia did not cry. She did not speak of him again. Her brother, her protector. Her monster was gone, and now she stood alone. Over time, Lucrezia shed her past like a snake discarding its skin, not out of shame, but out of necessity. She was now Duchess of Ferrara. She negotiated political alliances, mediated between nobles, managed court finances, even influenced papal decisions from afar. She founded charities, missioned churches, and supported the arts, giving refuge to poets like Ariosto, who would later write Orlando Furioso.2. The people of Ferrara, she was not a Borgia. She was their lady, but power came at a price. She gave birth to at least 8 children, enduring miscarriage, illness, and emotional isolation. Each child was a hope, each burial a wound. Her body broke. Her heart cracked, but she smiled still, because that's what survivors do. As the 1510s unfolded, Lucrezia Borgia's image in Ferrara had been fully transformed. Once branded a seductress, she was now a symbol of grace and maternal dignity. Had become a duchess of influence, a rare feat in Renaissance Italy, where women were often seen, never heard. Her court outshined others across the peninsula, rivaling even Florence in artistic prestige. She invited philosophers, humanists, architects. She issued grants to religious orders. And she extended mercy to enemies when men around her demanded vengeance. But as her power grew, her health began to break. She suffered repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, postnatal infections, private illnesses that never made the public record. She bore grief in silence, as was expected of her, but in her private writings, scraps of letters, personal prayers, a quiet storm brewed beneath the surface. Lucrezia often turned to writing, not for the public, not for history, but for herself. Her letters were full of longing, not for a lost lover, but for freedom. "I am a prisoner of velvet walls," she once wrote. "My soul speaks in silence, because no one listens when I scream." She knew what people whispered behind her back. She knew the stories of her being a seductress, a poisoner, a mistress of sin, all because she bore the name Borgia. And yet, she never publicly corrected them. She allowed the world to misunderstand her, because silence gave her a different kind of power. Mystery, and mystery lasted longer than truth, between 1515 and 1519. Tragedy visited her like an uninvited guest who never left. One of her young daughters died of illness. Another son succumbed to fever. A stillbirth nearly took her life. Each loss peeled away a layer of her strength, and yet she continued, smiling at court events, dressing in silk and gold, hosting poets, reviewing state letters. But her eyes no longer sparkled. The girl who once danced in Vatican halls was fading in her final years. Lucrezia spent more time in solitude. She turned toward religion, not the pomp of Rome, the quiet simplicity of faith. She began visiting convents, sponsoring nuns, and financing the restoration of monasteries, not out of penance, but perhaps for peace. She corresponded with theologians and mystics. She read texts of St. Augustine and Catherine of Siena, and for the first time in her life, she asked herself, "If I am not a Borgia, who am I?" The answer never came. But maybe that was the answer. In June of 1519, Lucrezia, now 39, became pregnant again. It was unexpected, dangerous. She was too weak, her body too fragile. But she did not refuse fate. On June 14th, she gave birth to a daughter. The baby died. So did Lucrezia. 10 days later, she passed from fever, exhaustion, and years of buried pain. No poison, no scandal, no murder, just a quiet end to a loud life. Her death stunned Ferrara, Townspeople gathered in candlelight, nobles wept. Artists laid their pens and brushes at the chapel door. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini. Surrounded by the sisters, she had supported women who remembered her not as a Borgia, but as Lucrezia. There was no papal envoy, no Vatican declaration, just silence. And in that silence, perhaps finally, peace. Centuries passed, writers began to revisit her life, and often far removed from the realities of Renaissance power, wrote tales of her beauty, her seduction, her supposed incest with Cesare and Rodrigo. Painters depicted her with snakes in her hair. Playwrights made her the villain of tragedies. Operas turned her into a symbol of deadly femininity. Rarely did they read her letters. Rarely did they study the archives in Ferrara. Rarely did they ask why she made the choices she made, because the truth is quiet and myths sell better. Lucrezia Borgia became a legend, not of her making, but of ours. Let us set aside the ink-stained lies. Lucrezia Borgia was a daughter used by a father's ambition, a pawn traded between kingdoms, a mother who buried more children than she held, a ruler who defied the odds and built a court of intellect and grace, a woman caught in the cruel machinery of history. She did not choose the family she was born into, but she chose how she lived, with elegance, endurance, and quiet rebellion. History tried to chain her to scandal, but time has begun to unlock her truth. Lucrezia's body had barely turned to dust when the world began reshaping her. Memory writers and poets, most of them, men, picked up their quills, not to document her life, but to redecorate it. They were not interested in truth. They wanted drama, sex, scandal, mystery, because Lucrezia Borgia, as she truly was a thoughtful duchess, a mother, Sfiver was too ordinary for the legends. They wanted to create, so they sharpened their pens and turned her into something monstrous. One myth spread faster than all the rest, that Lucrezia Borgia kept a hollow ring filled with deadly poison, which she used to slip into drinks during feasts. Never mind that no evidence exists, no witness, no autopsy, no confession. It didn't matter. It was a good story, better than the truth. And in Renaissance Europe, where court intrigue was already intoxicating, Lucrezia became the perfect character in a Gothic play. Every sudden death at the Vatican was blamed. Every whisper of betrayal and name floated in the air, and so began the poisoning of her legacy. Perhaps the darkest and most enduring lie was this, that Lucrezia had been romantically involved with her own brother Cesare, or even her father Pope Alexander VI. This rumor wasn't born in fact, but in politics. Enemies of the Borgia family, especially rival noble houses like the Orsini and Colonna, spread these stories to humiliate the family name. The logic was simple. If you can't defeat someone in power, it's poison their image. Even though countless Vatican records show no such evidence, no trials, no accusations, no confessions, the incest myth stuck. Why? Because society has always found it easier to believe that a powerful woman is sinful, not smart. In 1833, over 3 centuries after her death, Lucrezia's name was reborn in one of the most powerful storytelling formats of the time, opera. The legendary composer Gaetano Donizetti premiered Lucrezia Borgia, dramatic retelling of her life. Except this Lucrezia was a seductress, a killer, a tragic mother poisoned by her own sins. Audiences loved it. They didn't ask whether it was true. They only asked for more. The opera was such a hit that her story became part of popular European mythology. Paintings followed. Novels were written. Stage plays emerged across London and Paris. The real Lucrezia was buried a second time beneath a mountain of fiction. There is a pattern throughout history. When a woman in power does something exceptional, society often asks, did she sleep her way there? Lucrezia's life was interpreted not through her achievements, but through her relationships with men. Even centuries later, in modern history books, she's often defined by who she married, who she may have slept with, who may have died near her. Her political skills in Ferrara overshadowed her court patronage of humanists and artists. Rarely mentioned her letters of compassion, charity, and grief. It's lost in footnotes because she was born a woman. It's with the wrong last name. Thankfully, not all historians followed the myth. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars began revisiting original archives, Vatican correspondences, Ferrara court records, Lucrezia's private letters, diplomatic memos from Spanish and French ambassadors. What they found was shocking, not because it was salacious, but because it was so normal. She was intelligent, measured, occasionally sad, often gracious, rarely manipulative, and never once caught committing a crime. She wasn't a saint, but she was never the villain people made her out to be, even now. Lucrezia Borgia is used in books, games, and TV shows as shorthand for beautiful, dangerous woman seductress in the shadows, femme fatale, with a deadly secret from Assassin's Creed 2 HBO-style dramas. Her character has been twisted into an icon of corruption, often without reading a single letter she actually wrote. Why? Because complexity doesn't go viral. Caricature does. Lucrezia Borgia has become history's permanent suspect. She is tried again and again in the court of public opinion, not for what she did, but for what she might have done. And when someone says she was innocent, the world replies, but what if she wasn't? This is the curse of powerful women across centuries. They are rarely allowed to be innocent. Even in death. What if? Just once we took her words at face value. What if her letters of grief were real? What if her love for her children wasn't performative? What if her turn to religion was sincere, not manipulative? And what if she spent her entire life trying to escape a name the world wouldn't let her shed? History teaches us many things, but most of all, it teaches us to question the stories we've inherited. Because sometimes, the real tragedy isn't what happened, but what we chose to believe. By her mid-30s, Lucrezia had done what no Borgia ever truly managed. She stopped chasing power and started seeking peace. She spent her days in the court of Ferrara reading scripture, writing letters, managing accounts, and organizing plays, poetry readings, and charity work. At night, she visited convents, donated to the poor, and sat by her children's bedsides when they were sick. Her world had grown smaller, but gentler, not full of backroom deals and poisonings. Just the ordinary noise of a life lived honestly. For the first time, she was not a pawn, not a bride, not a scandal. She was just Lucrezia. In 1519, at age 39, Lucrezia became pregnant again. She had already endured many dangerous pregnancies, each one a coin toss between life and death. But she faced this new risk with quiet resolve. Maybe it was maternal instinct. Maybe it was a sense of spiritual closure. But this final pregnancy would be her undoing. On June 14th, she gave birth to a daughter. The baby lived only hours. Lucrezia's health collapsed shortly after. Fever, bleeding, infection. The Duchess, who had survived political storms, papal enemies, and centuries of rumor, was now brought down by the same force that had defined so much of her. Life, motherhood. Lucrezia died on June 24, 1519, surrounded not by scandal, but by her children, her priests. And her books, her final days, were filled with prayer, not to beg for forgiveness for imagined crimes, but to prepare for a peaceful departure. Even her critics had to admit, she died with dignity, with piety. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, a modest, silent place, far from Rome's marble palaces and bloody whispers. There was no opera, no scandal sheet, just a woman's name carved in stone. In her will, Lucrezia asked for little, modest burial prayers for her soul's small amounts left to charities, and to the poor no gold, no thrones, no statues. It was almost as if she wanted to disappear from history. But history refused to let her go. Centuries passed, kings were crowned. Empires rose and fell. A Borgia family faded into the background, but Lucrezia's name endured, not because of what she did, but because of what she was accused of. Writers, artists, filmmakers, and even politicians kept resurrecting her image. She became a metaphor for female ambition for beauty turned deadly. For power wrapped in perfume, the more society changed. The more Lucretia was reshaped to fit whatever fear or fantasy the age desired. Why did the world refuse to believe in her innocence? Because she committed the one unpardonable sin in patriarchal history. She survived men more powerful than her. She outlived her father, the Pope. She outlasted her brother Cesar, the warrior. She maneuvered through political hell and came out, breathing, and that's terrified people, because a woman who survives, a woman who wins, must be hiding something. Right, modern scholars now agree on key facts. No proof of poison, no proof of incest, no evidence of murder, numerous letters, showing compassion and diplomacy, even Pope Leo X, who succeeded her family's enemies, once remarked, "She governs her court with wisdom. Her people adore her." But these truths came centuries too late, because by the time the facts arrived, the fiction had already gone viral. Lucrezia Borgia left no surviving daughters. But she left behind a different kind of legacy. Her sons ruled minor duchies. Her name lived on in noble houses. But more than that, she became a mirror. When people talk about her, they reveal more about themselves than about Lucretia. The Victorians used her to warn about the dangers of lust. The feminists used her to showcase patriarchal lies. The pop culture world used her to sell books, shows, and games, and still she waits beneath a convent floor, buried in both silence and noise. Strip away the rumors. Ignore the gossip. Silence the plays and novels and half-true documentaries. What are you left with? A girl raised in a palace of corruption? A woman forced into marriages for her father's gain? A duchess who found grace and dignity despite a name that weighed like iron? She was not a saint. She was not a demon. She was simply a survivor. Why does Lucrezia Borgia still matter? Because even today, women are punished for being complex. Their narratives are shaped by who they married, who they loved, who they threatened. Lucretia's story teaches us that gossip is louder than truth. Beauty can become a curse. Power held by women is always questioned, but it also teaches us that a life of scandal can still be one of dignity, and sometimes the most radical act is to endure in a quiet corner of Ferrara. Her tomb sits untouched by tourists. No large sign, no candlelight vigil. But her story, built brick by brick from real history, can finally be told. Not as myth, not as monster, but as woman Lucrezia Borgia, born of sin, buried in grace. Finally remembered as she truly was.